Ladies and gentlemen, there's a strange silence that follows applause. You've probably noticed it. Right after the clapping fades, there's this stillness in the air, almost as if the room itself is holding its breath. That silence, that's where the truth lives. That's where the private life begins. The one that no one writes about, no one photographs, no one tweets. The life behind the public genius. People often think that genius is loud. They imagine it as an explosion, fireworks, breakthroughs, headlines. But in reality, it's almost always quiet. It's late nights alone, in the soft glow of a screen. It's the sound of someone talking to themselves, asking questions that have no easy answers. It's the trembling uncertainty that comes when you realize you're building something that might not work, that might never work, but you keep building anyway. I've spent years studying not just the brain, but the mind that drives invention. The hidden circuitry of obsession, the neurochemistry of isolation, the quiet burn of purpose. And what I've learned is this: behind every extraordinary human achievement lies an invisible emotional equation. Every genius pays for brilliance in a private currency no one else sees. Let's talk about that currency. When the world calls someone a visionary, what they're really describing is an imbalance, a neurological and emotional one. The human brain wasn't built to hold that much vision, that much ambition, that much chaos. The prefrontal cortex, the part that plans and imagines, starts running faster than the limbic system, which handles emotion. It's like the mind becomes a rocket without enough heat shields. It soars higher than most, but it also burns deeper. People who change the world often do it at the cost of their own peace. They live in a constant tug of war between clarity and confusion, creation and collapse. I've seen it in entrepreneurs, scientists, artists, brilliant people who build empires, invent technologies, and yet feel completely alone in a room full of admirers. Why? Because genius bends reality, but emotion resists being bent. There's a fascinating phenomenon neuroscientists call dopamine exhaustion. It happens when the brain becomes addicted to progress, to the reward of making something new, breaking barriers, proving the impossible possible. But like any addiction, the dose stops working. The applause that once felt like sunlight now feels like noise. The success that once gave meaning starts to feel mechanical. You start to wonder, if I'm achieving everything I dreamed of, why do I feel empty? That's the hidden paradox of achievement. You reach the top of the mountain and realize the air up there is thinner than you imagined. I've talked to engineers who built spacecraft, physicists who redefined our understanding of time, and they all share this quiet confession. The more extraordinary their public life becomes, the more fragile their private one feels. Relationships strain, sleep disappears, small joys fade. Every minute feels like it has to be justified by productivity, by progress, by proof that their existence is worth the noise it makes. And yet, there's beauty in that fragility, because it's in that fragile space that humanity lives. You see, the human brain is not just a machine for logic, it's a symphony of contradictions. It's built to imagine galaxies, but it's also built to crave touch. It's capable of building rockets, but also needs someone to say, "I'm proud of you." It's the same system that calculates the trajectory to Mars and remembers the smell of your mother's cooking. That duality, that tension between the cosmic and the intimate, is what makes the private life of a public genius so profoundly human. I once met a young researcher who worked on a breakthrough in AI. She told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Every time I solve a problem, I feel a second of joy and an hour of fear, because the moment I finish one thing, I'm terrified there won't be another problem big enough to make me feel alive again." That's dopamine exhaustion in motion. It's the mind's way of saying, you've built a world too large for your own heart to keep up with. And that's when people start hiding, behind work, behind logic, behind the myth of genius. Because hiding feels safer than being seen without the armor of achievement. But here's the deeper truth neuroscience has taught us: the same neural pathways that make us capable of great invention are the ones that make us capable of deep pain. The same intensity that fuels creation also fuels loneliness. When a mind is trained to think in extremes, to chase the edge of what's possible, it doesn't easily know how to rest in the middle ground. It doesn't know how to do normal. It lives at the edge of the spectrum, where brilliance meets burnout and passion meets exhaustion. And the public never sees that part. When a rocket launches, no one sees the countless failed tests, the sleepless engineers, the quiet tears at 3 a.m. When a company goes public, no one sees the founder pacing the floor, wondering if their identity has been consumed by their creation. When a scientist wins a Nobel, no one sees the friendships lost along the way. We see the light, not the heat that forged it. And that heat, let's talk about that. Because it's not just metaphorical. High achievers, according to neurological studies, literally run hotter. Their cortisol levels stay elevated longer. Their circadian rhythms destabilize. Their brain's reward systems start firing unpredictably. It's as if their entire nervous system is always on standby for the next discovery, the next crisis, the next impossible task. They live in perpetual anticipation, a kind of inner tension that looks like energy on stage, but feels like anxiety in private. The irony is, the world celebrates that tension. We call it drive. We call it passion. We call it vision. But in truth, it's also a form of survival. Because for many, slowing down would mean facing the emptiness that progress once helped them escape. I've always found it fascinating how the mind negotiates meaning. The prefrontal cortex can rationalize almost anything, pain, loneliness, exhaustion, if it believes it's serving a higher purpose. That's why so many brilliant people live on the edge of burnout. They're not reckless. They're driven by a moral logic that says, if this suffering creates something beautiful, maybe it's worth it. But the brain doesn't always agree. The brain keeps the score. And over time, it starts asking, what if the purpose you serve doesn't see you anymore? That's when genius starts to fracture. I've seen minds that once radiated light fall into the darkest silence. Depression among innovators is alarmingly high, not because they're weak, but because they've learned to equate stillness with failure. They forget that rest isn't the opposite of creation, it's the source of it. I remember speaking to a young engineer who told me he hadn't taken a full day off in 4 years. If I stop, he said, I might lose the edge. But neuroscience tells us the opposite. Creativity doesn't happen in the hustle, it happens in the pause. It happens when the brain switches from focused attention to what we call the default mode network. The system that activates when you daydream, when you rest, when you're doing nothing productive. That's where the mind makes connections between unrelated ideas. That's where innovation hides, in the silence, not the noise. Yet our world doesn't reward silence, it rewards spectacle. And so the private life of genius becomes a disappearing act. The more public you become, the less room there is for mystery, for vulnerability, for stillness. Every moment is observed, every word recorded, every expression analyzed. And that creates a strange kind of cognitive dissonance. The brain begins to treat its own emotions as data to manage, not experiences to feel. There's a cost to that. Because when you stop feeling, you stop being human. And when you stop being human, you stop creating from truth. That's the ultimate irony, the very thing that makes a genius extraordinary, the ability to feel deeply, to see patterns others don't, to imagine a different world, is the first thing that gets buried under the weight of their own success. It's a strange and quiet erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and realize you've lost touch with your inner life. It happens gradually. One day you stop laughing as hard. Another, you stop calling a friend back. Eventually, you find that your identity has become indistinguishable from your work. People talk to your ideas before they talk to you. You're applauded not for who you are, but for what you make. And that's the moment you start to disappear, not from the world, but from yourself. What's fascinating is that neuroscience can actually trace this disappearance. The amygdala, which processes emotion, starts showing reduced activation in high stress, high performance individuals. The brain literally begins to numb itself, not because it wants to, but because it has to survive the constant overload. It's a defense mechanism, like closing windows in a storm. But when the storm becomes your climate, you forget what fresh air feels like. In that state, genius can become a cage. The same mind that builds bridges to Mars becomes trapped inside the architecture of its own perfectionism. Every success raises the floor higher. There's no longer any ground to stand on, only pressure to keep ascending. The paradox is that the higher you climb, the more you need something deeply human to hold on to. Love, friendship, meaning. And yet those are often the first things that start to slip away. The private life of a public genius is rarely about luxury or fame. It's about the fight to stay real in a world that rewards illusion. It's the battle to remain human when everything around you tells you to become a symbol. People often think of greatness as a destination. But for many, it's a form of exile. I remember a neuroscientist friend once said to me, "The brain doesn't care if you're changing the world. It only cares if you feel connected." That stuck with me, because connection, human connection, is the single greatest stabilizer of the nervous system. It regulates our heartbeat, reduces inflammation, balances neurotransmitters. Yet it's the one thing the so-called driven people often neglect. They treat connection as optional, when in truth it's fundamental. You can't sustain genius without grounding it in relationship. There's something profoundly healing about being seen, not as an idea, not as a headline, but as a human being. Every great innovator I've known has at some point hit that wall the moment when the mind says, "You've given everything, and now it's time to feel again." Sometimes it's triggered by loss, sometimes by failure, sometimes by love, but it always comes. Because the brain craves wholeness, and wholeness demands honesty. Honesty is the great equalizer. It breaks the illusion that success and happiness are the same thing. It reminds us that emotional truth is not weakness, it's maintenance. The same way you maintain an engine, you have to maintain your humanity. You have to check in on the quieter parts of yourself, the ones that don't make noise, but make you you. Let me tell you something interesting from neuropsychology. When we experience empathy, when we truly connect with another person, the brain releases oxytocin. This chemical not only makes us feel trust, it literally calms the amygdala, lowers stress, and increases focus. In other words, kindness sharpens intelligence. Compassion stabilizes creativity. Empathy is not a distraction from genius. It's the fuel for it. And yet, in the private lives of many great thinkers and builders, empathy is often replaced by efficiency. Time becomes currency. Love becomes logistics. Conversation becomes scheduling. The irony is brutal. The people most capable of imagining the future often struggle most to be present in the now. But here's the hopeful part, the part I've seen transform even the most restless minds. When they finally slow down, when they let themselves reconnect, to breathe, to rest, they don't lose their genius, they amplify it. Because creativity isn't a race, it's a rhythm. It requires both expansion and contraction. You can't innovate endlessly without reflection. You can't build outward without occasionally turning inward. Think of the brain as an ecosystem, not a factory. It needs balance between logic and emotion, solitude and connection, chaos and calm. When one element dominates, the system collapses. But when they coexist, the mind becomes limitless. The quiet becomes fertile ground for insight. There's a moment that always moves me during launches, not when the rocket lifts off, but when the engines cut off in space. That sudden stillness, that floating silence, it's the most powerful sound there is, because that's when you realize that motion alone doesn't define progress. Sometimes stillness does. The same is true in the human mind. Stillness doesn't mean stopping. It means stabilizing. It means re-entering orbit emotionally before you burn out of the atmosphere. And I think that's what many people misunderstand about those who seem unstoppable. They assume the engine never cools. But it does. It has to. Even the most driven minds need recalibration, not just mechanically but emotionally, because every equation has a human variable, and if you ignore that, the formula collapses. I once knew a man, a physicist, who devoted his entire life to understanding time. He was brilliant, tireless, obsessed with measuring the unmeasurable. One day after a lecture, I asked him, "Have you ever thought about how much time you've spent chasing time?" He paused for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Yes, and that's the only time I've ever truly lost." That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that the line between purpose and obsession is as thin as a neuron's membrane. And when that line blurs, you start to trade moments of living for moments of proving. The brain, you see, is not infinite. It's miraculous, but it's mortal. Every thought, every idea, every surge of inspiration burns glucose, drains energy, rewires circuits. And when we push it too hard, too long, the same brilliance that once illuminated the world can begin to consume itself. But there's another side to this story, a redemptive one. Because every mind, no matter how overworked or overwhelmed, can be rebalanced. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, means recovery is always possible. Emotional intelligence can be rebuilt even after years of neglect. Connection can be rekindled. And often, when that happens, the genius that reemerges is deeper, more compassionate, more grounded. I've seen innovators rediscover joy not through achievement, but through small acts: teaching a child, cooking a meal, sitting in silence with someone they love. Those moments don't make headlines, but they heal the neural pathways that ambition alone cannot. They remind us that genius without gentleness becomes machinery, and that the real miracle of intelligence is not in how much we can build, but in how much we can feel. I think of creativity as electricity. It needs resistance to light up. Emotion provides that resistance. Without it, everything burns out. The private life, the inner emotional world, is that grounding wire. It absorbs the charge. It keeps the current alive. We often forget that behind every innovation is a beating heart. Behind every breakthrough is a person wondering if it's enough. Behind every public genius is a private life, fragile, complex, and profoundly human. And the measure of greatness isn't how far you go, but how much of yourself you manage to keep intact along the way. There's something quietly heroic about those who learn to balance both worlds, the public and the private, the ones who build extraordinary things, but still know how to love, the ones who can hold a vision for humanity and still hold someone's hand. Those are the people who remind us that progress without empathy is just motion, and motion without meaning is just noise. And maybe that's the emotional truth we all have to face, that the future will be built not just by intelligence, but by emotional courage, by people brave enough to be vulnerable, to be honest, to say, "I'm brilliant, but I'm also human." Because the next frontier isn't Mars or AI or energy, it's emotional sustainability. It's learning how to build without breaking ourselves. The private life behind the public genius isn't a secret. It's a sanctuary. It's the space where we rediscover why we began, who we love, and what it means to be alive. It's the silence between the applause, the stillness where purpose becomes peace. So tonight, if you take anything from this, let it be this: protect your inner world. Guard it not with walls, but with awareness. Nurture it the way you would a fragile ecosystem. Because the future doesn't just need innovation, it needs wholeness. And that begins not in the spotlight, but in the quiet corners of your own heart. Thank you.